All right, welcome to our lecture on how languages diffuse. The slides were designed to accompany the textbook People, Places, and Culture, and I am, of course, Miss Gall, and I'll be your lecturer for the day. So, we start out, we could go way, way back and talk about languages. We're really going to start out about 2,000 years ago, and look at languages such as Chinese and Latin, which successfully diffused over large regions. And we're talking about both of those languages. It's largely conquest is what enables those languages to diffuse, is that the Romans and the Chinese Empire go out and they conquer large territories and then conduct the government. The official language, the language of government, is either Mandarin Chinese or Latin, depending on, again, whether we're talking about China or Rome. And because that's the official government, that then becomes adopted generally locally as a second language, and then ultimately as one of the major languages in the region. So we've got these languages that are spread out over wide areas, but what they're not is not standardized. In other words, words in Latin might be said slightly differently or spelled slightly differently in, say, Spain than in France than in Italy. But what really changes that is the invention of the printing press. Okay, and the printing press gets invented in China much earlier than it does in Europe, but when it finally hits Europe, the Gutenberg printing press in the late Middle Ages, right around the, I think, mid-1400s, give or take, what it does is it combines with that rise of nation states that we start to see happening around the 1500s or so, and it works to encourage the spread of literacy and helps to stabilize certain languages through the use of written forms, and more specifically, widely distributed written forms. So prior to the Gutenberg printing press in Europe, all books were handwritten. Okay, and that doesn't lend itself to stabilizing language because it takes a long time to hand copy books. And when you're hand copying, you can make mistakes in multiple varieties of the same type of mistake. Right? So what we see in conjunction with that, that start to stabilize language and to standardize it through the increasing literacy and the use of the printing press, is with that the rise of large independent states, because these states have a strong interest in promoting common culture, and one of the easiest ways to do that is to promote a common language, again, to standardize that language and to insist on its use throughout the territory by the state, or throughout the territory of the state. And so what we've seen across time, from really, in a lot of ways, the late Middle Ages onwards, is this kind of gradual shrinking in terms of the world's linguistic heritage, so the number of different languages and varieties of languages spoken, and that's becoming increasingly common and increasingly more of a problem in today with how rapidly we're globalizing, and as people may choose to not speak the language they grew up with in order to speak a lingua franca, like, say, English, and ultimately not teach the language they grew up with to their children because it's not perceived as being necessarily a useful language. And so we have languages actually dying out. And speaking of lingua francas, really these are languages that are used among speakers of different languages for purposes of trade or commerce. Okay, so they can be single languages. They could be a mixture of two or more languages. Today, the lingua franca in most cases is English. Certainly Mandarin Chinese is becoming an increasingly used lingua franca. As the name implies, French for a long time, for probably about 300 years or so, was the lingua franca. Okay, it was used for trade, it was used for commerce. In many areas, especially in Europe, it was used for government. Right? Roman would be an example of a historic lingua franca. Okay, but when we talk about these, again, like I said, it can be a single language, right? It could be Latin, could be English, but it could also be a pidgin language. And pidgin languages are what happen when people who speak two or more languages come in contact and they start to combine different parts of their languages and simplify it down in terms of the structure and the vocabulary, right? So we joke, for instance, in the US maybe about speaking Spanglish, but that would be the kind of thing they're talking about. Creole languages, on the other hand, are what happen when pidgin languages start to become more complex in terms of the structure and the vocabulary, and they turn around and become the native language of a group of people. So, for example, we talk about Creole French in, say, Louisiana, or even French, I would argue, probably in Quebec is a little bit of a Creole language. Okay, certainly in some of the best examples, though, can be found in the Caribbean, where Creole languages typically combine a combination of African languages, either French or English, pardon me, along with indigenous vocabularies to create this whole new language that then becomes the native language of the group of people who live on the islands. So we've got, when we talk about countries of the world, really we can split them into kind of two major categories when we're talking about language. We can split them into multilingual states, and as the name implies, these are countries in which more than one language is in use. And so these would be countries with more than one official language, okay, generally speaking. Or countries where there are enough speakers of different languages that those languages are commonly spoken. But then we can also, examples of multilingual states would include most countries in Africa. Certainly I would make the argument for the United States as a multilingual state, if nothing else. Talk about English and Spanish, and that's certainly before we get into the various indigenous languages that are spoken, or immigrant groups that come in large numbers and speak and bring in their native languages, right? Canada would be another example of a multilingual state with French and English. Okay, but we can also talk about monolingual states, and again, as the name implies, these are states, these are countries where pretty much everybody speaks the same language. Places like Japan or Uruguay, Iceland, Denmark, Portugal, Poland, Lesotho. Okay, places where everybody speaks one language. Much of Europe is very monolingual. Okay, and with this idea again of monolingual and multilingual, what we need to talk about are things like official languages. Okay, and in particular, countries with linguistic fragmentation will adopt an official language or official languages as a way of kind of tying people together and helping create a common culture. So it creates this centripetal force to tie people together, right? And they do this as a way of promoting communication and interaction among different local, cultural, and regional languages and different groups. And also as a way, again, of kind of tying people together to create a common culture out of what may be a very linguistically and culturally different set of societies. And official languages are typically a reflection of a country's history, right? So in the United States, we were originally settled or conquered. You take your pick in terms of how you want to use the language, but folks from England, and so English is the most commonly used language in the US, certainly not the only one, but it's the most commonly used language in the US. And that reflects that history of British settlement. We want to talk about in Africa, a lot of African countries have adopted as official languages the languages of their former colonizers because of that extreme linguistic fragmentation. So Nigeria, for example, we talked about this in one of the other lectures, about 500 different languages spoken in various areas of Nigeria. The official language is English because that language is not going to privilege any one group of people over another. There are areas of Africa where the official language is French or German or Portuguese, right? And again, reflects that history of colonization, reflects that history of linguistic fragmentation and a need to try and tie groups together in such a way that we're not privileging one cultural group over another to keep the whole country together. We talk about global languages, right? These are the languages that people around the world use for their day-to-day activities. And really we're talking about more or less the principal language. So if we're talking about, for example, the internet, the global language of the internet is English. Somewhere in the neighborhood of 70% of everything on the internet is in English. Right? If we're talking about trade or commerce, again, English is an incredibly common one, and that reflects the American dominance of the world economy. At least today it does. Historically, we could talk about it reflecting, for example, the British dominance of the world economy, and certainly reflects that history of dominance by British-speaking peoples. So that's our lecture, talking a little bit about how languages diffuse and kind of how they spread out in different types of language. Talked about official languages, we talked about global languages, and all kinds of things like that. So if you have any questions, please feel free to bring them into class, and I'd be delighted to answer them and do what I can. And I'll see you the next time we meet.